All right, and we're live. Take it away, Edgar.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Edgar Villanueva, Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education. Thank you for joining us today for what will be our second in a series of exclusive conversations we are hosting in celebration of Schott's 25th anniversary. The Schott Foundation is a national philanthropic organization that focuses on educational opportunity, healthy living and learning communities, and community-led change. We accelerate advocacy by supporting local, statewide, and national campaigns that are working to close the opportunity gap faced by low-income and children of color in the United States. This 25th anniversary series is an opportunity for us to spotlight the critical body of work that we at Schott, along with our partners, have been supporting as a part of our growing National Opportunity to Learn network. We see this as an opportunity to engage movement and policy leaders to reflect on our collective history together, to share our stories and highlights about how far we've come, but also to reflect on how far we need to go in building a broad-based movement to accelerate change for our young people. In today's conversation, it will be moderated by Schott's President and CEO, Dr. John Jackson, and he will introduce our distinguished guest momentarily. I want to encourage everyone watching today to join the conversation. Add your thoughts and questions in the chat box on the webinar, as well as to join online on Twitter. Schott's handle is @SchottFound, SCHOTTFOUND, and please use the hashtag GrassrootsEd, and we'll be sure to bring your questions to the conversation. We'll save time at the end today to respond to questions posed to our panelists. Well, without further delay, I'd like to pass it off to Dr. Jackson to kick us off.
Thank you, Edgar. Hi, I'm John Jackson, President and CEO of the Schott Foundation for Public Education, here at the luxurious Homewood Suites in DC, microwave and all. And I will be your moderator today for what is the second in a series of conversations we are hosting in honor of Schott's 25th anniversary celebration. The 25th anniversary series is an opportunity, as Edgar mentioned, to highlight critical bodies of work that we and so many of our partners have been engaged in moving forward, whether it's the National Opportunity to Learn Network, Alliance to Reclaim Our School, Education Justice Network, Dignity in Schools, or Journey for Justice. I think we all share a common desire and urgency to ensure that all children have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. To this end, this is why we are happy to have the discussion today entitled Protecting an Opportunity to Learn Through ESSA Accountability Plans. Many of you are aware that in 2015, Congress reauthorized the Elementary Secondary Education Act, formerly known as the No Child Left Behind Act, and now the new bill, which is called the Every Student Succeed Act, or ESSA, has been largely summed up as allowing for more flexibility at the state and local level to develop plans and allocate resources. With this flexibility also comes concerns, however. One doesn't have to be a history scholar to know that creating a states' rights policy structure on key equity issues hasn't always worked out for people of color or low-income individuals. It is precisely this dynamic that we hope to explore in our conversation today. That's why I'm glad to have with us first, Dr. Michael Kurse. Dr. Kurse is the president of the California State Board of Education and was named the 2016 Educator of the Year by Loyola Marymount University in recognition of his decades of tireless work to improve public education for all Californians. Dr. Kurse is considered by many to be the key architect of California's new local control funding formula, which since 2013 has led school districts to develop local control accountability plans with community input to ensure that education funding goes to improving learning conditions for all children. I'm also delighted to be joined today by Dr. Tiffany Anderson, Superintendent of the historic Topeka Public School. Dr. Anderson has been hailed for her holistic approach to improving public education as a leader that doesn't flinch from addressing the many systemic inequities that children face before they even step foot on school grounds, from a food pantry to a health clinic and a shelter for homeless students. Dr. Anderson has shown that tackling inequity not only improves children's well-being, but also improves their academic performance. We will use the next hour to explore the insights on how you, parents, educators, youth funders, advocates, policymakers can work to protect an opportunity to learn and advance equity through ESSA state accountability plans from a local and state perspective. I want to start the discussion with Dr. Kearse. Dr. Kearse, welcome. My question is related to the new flexibility that ESSA offers state education agencies. Can you talk about how California is approaching the process of developing their state plans?
Yes, and thank you for having me. As we know, the current ESSA is a descendant of the 1965 law called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, passed by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965. And I was actually the second person hired in the U.S. Office of Education to administer Title I in 1965. So it's a long-standing policy, and this is a very important time. ESSA is a major overhaul of No Child Left Behind, which was passed in 2001. So many state policies on federal aid have not been overhauled for more than 10 years. So the first thing we're looking at is to take advantage of the state and local flexibility in the Act to rethink and overhaul the federal aid system. So there are some explicit limits in the bill on what the U.S. Education Department can do. It, for example, greatly restricts the U.S. Department of Education on waivers, specifying teacher evaluation, specifying curriculum, and specifying the intervention strategies that the accountability systems trigger at that point. Now, the first thing we looked at, of course, is that federal aid is 10% of our total expenditures in K-12 in California. So how do we use ESSA to get leverage other 90% of funding? And it offers opportunities, as I'll indicate, to do that. So the first question we're asking is, what is federal aid and federal funding being used for now? Often these programs have been running on autopilot, deep in bureaucracies without really being overhauled. How should federal aid be changed to reach the high academic standards that all states have promulgated in recent years? That's featured in the law. So we've all revamped our education standards towards college ready. We need to rethink ESSA there. How can a state integrate the various titles, there's 4 major ones, so that they do something rather than just be separate post-hold titles without any interaction? And California will be featuring capacity building of local educators, professional development, enhancing their ability to teach to high standards, particularly teachers and principals. So that we really are looking at that. Lastly, we view the law as abrogating all state local applications for every one of the titles. So the next thing we're looking at is how to redo the applications, local applications, which states must approve, so that we have new criteria and we shake the system up a little bit, which we view as become somewhat ossified and post-hold. So I'll stop there, and then I think my colleague will talk a little bit about accountability after we've approved the applications.
John, I believe you're on mute.
I think, John, you're on mute.
There we go. Great.
Okay, great. I was talking to Dr. Anderson concerning the impact of the ESSA on local education agencies, really trying to get an understanding of what are the opportunities and challenges that ESSA presents for local educational agencies.
Now, there are many opportunities that it presents, but as with any new system, when a new system is introduced, there's also a burden that is carried with that, such as we have, as now we have the burden of really looking at, as a state determining the various criteria by which we need to implement a variety of assessment tools. And so for us, and I'll just use Topeka as, Topeka Public Schools, we literally have had to invest in an assessment system to really track all these new requirements. So there's a great deal of flexibility, but the tracking of college and career readiness, some of these things are things, we should be doing anyway, but tracking the various systems in order to ensure that the accountability plan is followed and that we can meet the additional mandates. Now we really have state and local requirements that we have to make sure that we track and we follow very closely. And so, once that accountability plan is put in place, it's making sure that you have a very comprehensive plan, which is good. It's a very holistic plan. It's not a one-size-fit-all, which is what NCLB was. And so that's a good piece. But when we talk about equity in any school district, every school district, particularly the higher poverty, will have different abilities to be able to fully track all of the various requirements that we have to track in order to follow the mandates that we now have. And the mandates vary. And so, and I know we'll get more into that a little bit later, but the college and career readiness for us in Topeka Public Schools is a very large part of what we need to be doing in terms of tracking young people when they leave, but also tracking career education, career technical education. There are a variety of other kinds of things that weren't previously tracked in this way. So we really have to develop a system. So in a way that sets its own burden because there's a timeline by which these things need to be implemented. So the flexibility to some degree is needed, and particularly when it comes to teacher evaluation. And states now have the opportunity to look at what highly qualified is. There's opportunities as it relates to the assessment instruments that we use, but all of that also falls back on a local level in terms of what is this going to look like and how we need to make sure that it occurs. Lastly, for us and for many other places as well beyond Kansas, the new state measurements, the assessment tools for most folks are changing. And so that also is another area in which it requires for us to really rethink how we are preparing for those students for those state assessments and rethink what are the resources we need to put in place. So those are some challenges, opportunities, but also challenges when you begin to talk about how does a district that's high poverty or how does a district that's rural or urban, how we ensure that we implement all of these new mandates on a state level while also, meeting the needs and guidelines from a federal level.
My computer, for some reason, wants to stay on mute, so I'm not going to ask you all to read lips. I want to just go to the issue of engaging parents, and I'm going to ask someone to mute your computer because we're getting a little feedback. Thank you. I'm a parent, I'm an advocate, and I'm not aware of the different titles that we've talked about. I'm not aware of all of the policy infrastructure and how the resources flow. What I do care about is that my child is not getting pushed out of school, that disciplinary policies don't create the climate where the students are not engaged. I do care that the schools are getting the resources and that students have an opportunity to learn. So I want to, ask both of you all, can you talk a little bit about the process that parents and local advocates should be engaged in right now to ensure that those pieces are addressed through the accountability plans, how to ensure that that flexibility is used in such a way that it creates more equitable outcomes and more whole child supports for students?
Well, I think that the applications, you know, the local educational agencies like Topeka will have to apply for federal aid. Those will have to go through the local school boards. So looking at what students are going to get, how the money is going to be spent, I think is important. But the federal law is pretty specific on accountability. So California's already approved an accountability system, and we have filled in what is required by the federal government of 5 key, what we're calling top line indicators. And we will be sending these to all parents. So the 5 that we picked are the English language arts and mathematics assessments. Those will be reported by district and school. So parents will know how their school is doing. That's one. Second, English learner proficiency. Up and measured very carefully in many cases. Rates. Fourth is a combination of chronic absenteeism, where students at that school are highly absent, and suspension rates. And lastly, we have a college and career readiness composite indicator, which looks at the courses students are taking at the school, which prepare them for college, and also at career technical education courses. Now, we also have some local indicators I won't mention today, which will supplement this out. But I want to stress that the accountability system is moldable measures. The federal government moved away from test scores as the sole measure to moldable measures. It said states could nominate their own measures. We chose chronic absenteeism and suspension rates as key indicators, and that these results will be reported for each school to the parents by the status of the measure, where are we on math, by whether it's improving significantly, and then it'll be broken down for 13 different subgroups that may exist at schools. So that gives you an idea that there'll be quite a bit of reporting, and then we can talk about what states do if there's not enough progress.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question about parents, and I think there are a couple of things that that are important to keep in mind, particularly for parents in a high mobility area. You know, you leave from a state like you know, if you leave from California and you come to Topeka, Kansas, things may look a little different in terms of requirements and what that looks like. So the first thing I would ask in terms of a parent, you know, most school districts, most LEAs have something on their website. We're required to have the report card. The report card now looks different, the various measures on the report card. And so looking to see, you know, what is our plan, what that particular school's plan is, the school district's plan is in terms of accountability. I would also suggest for parents to make sure that they are aware of what are the measurements by which their children are being assessed, and making sure that they have an understanding. There are a great deal of resources available for parents as well in terms of remediation and areas in which students have intervention services, and there's a great deal of flexibility. And so if a student is not progressing in the manner that a parent would like to see, certainly asking the school system, what are those intervention opportunities that are available, and what are the funding streams in which they can tap into as parents to utilize those various systems. I think I would encourage for parents to be empowered with the knowledge of how their school system is being held accountable, as well as understanding what accountability means. You know, the biggest thing is that the definition of what a successful school looks different now than what it looked like under NCLB. And so the one thing that we know, we have a 30% mobility rate. And for other school districts that have that or higher, you have people that move from state to state, from district to district. Certainly between Missouri and Kansas, we fairly close, so we overlap. And so I think understanding your particular state's implementation of ESSA will look different from state to state, quite possibly. So having that understanding when you have that level of mobility, again, looking at the area of equity. Kansas has done a fantastic job with having a Kansas Learning Network already that really wraps its arms around school districts and giving kind of a coaching model and understanding the root cause. This just gives greater flexibility in that area, but there certainly will be some changes in terms of what's assessed, how it's assessed, and what determines a school district is successful or not.
Great. And as we have been transitioning from NCLB, No Child Left Behind, much of the conversation around NCLB and much of the critique has been around the amount of tests, the amount of testing, the drill and kill as it played out in some of the local areas. Can you share a little bit about how, in your opinion, ESSA takes on this testing issue? Whether it's more of the same, whether there's some flexibility there, or whether there are additional opportunities relative to assessment.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that the states, including Kansas and California, and most all of them, have revamped their assessments or tests since NCLB started, and really geared them to new higher standards with much more emphasis on college and career readiness. So we have moved away entirely from the old bubble tests that are paper and pencil, where you just pick one of 4 or 5 options on a test.
Right.
Our test is used in the far west by many states. Kansas has a different test. It's computer adaptive. Each student, as students are answering hard questions, we give you harder questions, so it's individualized. It has extended response. It's all on computer, where students have to defend their answers. They just can't bubble in 1 out of 4. And it has a performance exam where they have to take facts on an issue like nuclear power, put them together, and come up with a solution. So one can argue it's not a bad thing to teach to a good test. What I think NCLB did was force a lot of teaching into bad tests. So we believe our tests are better. That's the first thing I think parents should think about and look at in this regard. Moreover, as I indicated, the federal law says you should highlight, you as a state, and then report to local districts and parents 5 indicators. I reel those off. That's a very different approach. So that means you can, as a state level, make judgments about, well, how is this school doing on all 5 of these indicators? They may have high test scores, but a whole lot of dropouts. That'll drive up your test score because your dropouts are often low scores. So we're going to look at all 5.
That's great. Dr. Anderson, anything there?
You know, and I see my computer was muted as well and would not unmute. So I think I'm back on for me. And I've had the pleasure of being most recently, previous to this, in Missouri, and now I'm in Kansas. So I'll speak from both ends of the coin. And as my colleague said, the test has been revamped. Unfortunately, in states like Missouri and in Kansas, it's been revamped 2 or 3 times in the last 3 years. And so literally the test that they had last year was the same as the prior year, but the year prior to that, it was different. And so Missouri is similar. And so the test has changed, for 3 or 4 years in a row for some places. And Missouri and Kansas is a good example of that. At this point, it appears that we're now under greater stability now that we have ESSA in place and we really know more of what we're doing and doing the accountability plans. But here's the issue. I don't believe that really you have to teach to a test. I think you should be teaching the standards. So really understanding the standards and making sure kids master that. You know, one of the areas that's a much greater focus under ESSA is college and career readiness, and that idea of making sure that young people are prepared for a career when they leave high school. And so, and they have a good post-secondary education plan. That was not a significant piece of NCLB, and it is now. But then there's that question of how do you measure that? And so some states are looking at that career technical education and how many people are getting industry credentials. Some are really looking at tracking kids through college. All of those things are good to do, but it's still a matter of now it's a matter of really looking at preparing kids for college and not just focusing on a test. A test only gives you, especially if you're just saying your math and English test, whether it's a bubble in or a performance-based test, it gives you a number, a score. That is only part of the picture. We're about serving the whole child. We're about making sure that all of those needs are met. ESSA does give you greater flexibility with the intervention to that, with the college and career readiness piece, with looking at dropout rates, suspension rates. All of those things can now be looked at, which it's good, but it's making sure that districts that don't have a lot of resources have the ability to have a good system in place to really look at all of those areas in a comprehensive way. So the drill and kill is not there in the way that it was under NCLB. That's the good news. But the other part of that news is making sure that there's a good comprehensive way, and this goes back to parents understanding and teachers understanding really how we're being assessed and making sure there's a good comprehensive plan that makes sense. In Kansas, as we have our new assessment in place, many of the schools in the state of Kansas, as in many states, same with Missouri, didn't score as well as they did previously because they're getting used to the new format and the new system. And so as we get used to that, again, I continue to preach to the standard. Let's understand the standard by which we're being assessed and then teach for mastery of standards and making sure as parents, you know what those standards are. So no matter where you are, you know what your child needs to master to do well in that state, but to be prepared to enter into college in any state.
That's great. I appreciate the whole child support. I want to ask one more question before we open it up for questions from other participants on the webinar. What concerns both of you all the most about the ESSA process and the new flexibility that's provided through ESSA?
Well, I think that in the short run, we're somewhat worried about whether the U.S. Department of Education will try and add on to the law through extensive detailed regulations that will hinder us in doing what we want. And so I think that's, the Secretary of Education, Mr. King, has gone beyond the law in his proposed regulations. So we're really worried about that. Our biggest worry is that we have raised our standards in both states, and we have not invested enough money in our teachers and principals and school people to really teach to those standards. And so will we be able to use ESSA, as I started off talking about, to build the capacity to meet these standards through better teaching? So our concern is how to use ESSA to improve classroom instruction. That's very different, I think, than Title I was back in the 60s, and was not as clear in NCLB. It was more about punishment, corrective action, words of that sort.
That's right. Dr. Anderson?
And I would agree and build on to that. I think one of the items, that you really want to think about is when you start talking about alternative testing, because there's that piece within, ESSA as it relates to alternative testing and having those proficiency goals and now the failure to reach those have been eliminated. But if you talk about alternative testing, making sure that we really understand what that means, and will kids have to have special diplomas, or what the end result of that is. The other piece is that flexibility that we now have in testing, and I'm going to go back to that in terms of the format. I'm interested in learning more about the CAP. That idea that only 1% of the students will qualify for alternative testing and 10% if it's disabilities. I think that's potentially an issue in terms of that cap for alternative testing. Another area really when you talk about mandates, as I said earlier, when you have state now and federal mandates, making sure that the resources are there, as my colleague just spoke of, to really be able to not only follow the mandates, but implement something with a meaning and purpose, and making sure that we can fully implement this in a way that improves teaching and learning. Kansas is certainly a state that's been struggling with education funding, and that has been a concern for the state as a whole. And so now we have ESSA, which gives flexibility, but can we really take advantage of the kind of flexibility that's there when we are already strapped as it relates to funding from a state perspective? And so I think there are some barriers that could certainly still be there, and time will tell how this comes out. I am always concerned about regulation, and when things are regulated, what that begins to look like. Again, I think that's a time will tell issue. So those are just some of the items that, at least for me, and I would say for others, should be something to kind of look out for down the line.
That's great. Thank you, both. Edgar, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's open it up and get some questions from other participants on the webinar.
Sure, absolutely. We have some questions that have been coming in. We want to remind our participants you can submit questions in the chat box on the webinar or tweet your questions with the hashtag #GrassrootsEd. Our first question is, what capacities should state and advocates be looking to build to ensure that ESSA can address the equity challenge that we've been talking about?
Well, I think that we mentioned some of these, which is what's your local school and school district currently doing with this federal aid? Has it changed recently in terms of what they're spending it on? How is the school and school district trying to make students college and career ready, and how does ESSA play into that? All of those, and in our case where we're asking for new local applications in California, how is that reflected in our in the applications? So I think that's the first area, and I don't think parents should assume that what's been done for the past 5 or 10 years is necessarily what needs to be done in the future. So they're looking for change, I think, and this is a change law, and that change should come about. And then I think they want to take a hard look at the multiple indicators as they build up over time and look more for improvement and change, improvement up, rather than just looking at the status, meaning, okay, the school is low, but there's a big difference between low performing schools and schools that are low performing and improving rapidly. And I keep my eye on that improvement, which we can do a lot more with now. Under NCLB, you either got over a bar or you didn't. And anything that was improving below the bar that they set in NCLB was viewed as irrelevant. Now we can look at improvement, and I think that's an important thing.
Right.
Now, I would agree with that. And you know, one of the things in terms of building capacity, and I think that's one of the areas that isn't always as given as much attention to, professional development and time. You know, time to really understand kind of all of the implications so that we are not creating plans that ultimately down the line may shoot us in the foot in some ways, you know, in terms of the assessment instrument, how that plays itself out in our school systems, expectations for grade levels and requirements and other mandates that the LEAs place on themselves, again, trying to meet a particular mandate. And so I think giving time for collaboration, professional development, I think that's an area that's often not funded as much as it needs to be, and the investment in our people and making sure that they fully understand the various ways that this can play itself out. You know, the other item in terms of capacity building, and this is just reality not only for Kansas but for many places, and I'm going to give a real practical example so we're not speaking in generalities. In Kansas, being here, and I started in Topeka, Kansas, July 1st. And so one of the things we looked at is college and career readiness and capacity to really make sure that every student leaves high school and goes straight into their post-secondary opportunity, whatever that is, college or a career. And so and there's some true struggles. So in a state that has not been education funding friendly in the manner that we would hope, you know, we are underfunded when it comes to our ability to really have enough counselors, social workers, all of those things in our school systems. And we are not the only school system that's like that. There are school systems across the nation that don't have enough counselors. You know, in a district, any district really, the national average for counselors is 1 to 250 counselors. And Kansas, as many others, have 1 to 500 on average. The average mental health worker should be 1 to 500. We have 1 to 1,000, as do many other school districts. So, you know, you come into a school district with this new mandate about college and career readiness, but we're already understaffed when it comes to counseling. So then what do? So for us, in terms of building capacity, reality is whether or not there was a mandate, we need to make sure our young people are successful in post-secondary. So one of the strategies, just as a practical piece for us at an LEA level, coming into central office, I just asked all of the central office staff to participate in selecting one senior that they're to track. We're giving our central office staff the training in the area of college and career readiness, and they are literally every month meeting with seniors. This is central office folks, the finance department, the technology department. I know that sounds unusual, but at the end of the day, I need 50, 60 people, or 30 or 40 or however many people sign up, no matter what size of central office, or I need that many extra people to be working with my kids. And so I am fortunate in that central office folks signed up, the food service person, the finance person, all of these folks signed up. We've had our first meeting. I'm excited. October 12th, we'll be meeting with our seniors. So immediately we are building capacity with a meaningful adult, connecting with that student, making sure that, that October FAFSA was filled out and tracking them. But that's just one example on the LEA level. But reality is when you have mandates and they're unfunded, and you already are a state that is having difficulty funding schools, much less being an LEA that has difficulty funding, getting the funding that we need on a local level, it's an issue, it's a challenge to be able to successfully meet the mandates that are put upon us.
Thank you. We have a question about how we can increase transparency in terms of where funds are going to address issues. Looking around supplement versus supplanting. Do you guys have any thoughts about that question?
Well, the U.S. Department of Education has not sent out their draft regulations based on the law yet. And so I think that question is one that we're in California really waiting for guidance on. And they have been more explicit on teacher quality. And I think what's the thing that people and parents can look at is that we as states are going to have to collect much more data on the quality of teachers by school. And their requirement will highlight schools that the federal requirement that have lots of teachers that are emergency credentials or interns, or just beginning. And so I think the supplement and not supplant idea has moved beyond just tracking dollars to tracking the differential teacher quality that's spread across districts and within districts. And that's something also we're waiting for clarification. But I think that's a very important new indicator which is out there.
I would agree with what's been stated, and that's one of those time will tell items that I mentioned earlier. So I think we do need to wait and get more information to be able to know the impact of that. And that also goes back to our building capacity and making sure that we really understand the implications as we prepare these plans, so that these accountability plans really can be carried out with the resources we have without bumping into that supplanting and that supplanting issue.
Thank you. Our next question comes from our friends at the National Education Policy Center, who are specifically asking about Kansas. Dr. Anderson, what are the opportunity to learn or equity measures being used by Kansas, and do you think that parents in other states should be advocating for them?
Much like it's not that different from California in the sense of the areas in which we are utilizing, and I think my mute is off. Is my mute off, or is it, because I know it's sticking? Okay. So, in Kansas, the Kansas Learning Network, which I referenced earlier, they have implemented coaches previously, and now that we're looking at the new measures that we still have our ELA and math areas, but college and career readiness has really taken a strong piece for what we're doing, and they're aligning it with the new accreditation process, which is absolutely fantastic in my mind. So in Kansas, ESSA and accreditation are one and the same, as which is different than some other states that have two different systems in place in terms of how you become accredited as a district and what ESSA now requires. So really, when you're meeting the ESSA standards, you're also meeting the accreditation standards, but not very different than what has been shared in terms of the California indicators. Ours are very similar. I think the differences between states are going to be how that rolls itself out. The assessment instruments are different, and what that looks like in terms of those pieces. And so for Kansas, in fact, this week, our district, as a LEA, we are realigning our strategic plan and and really our mission, vision, all of that is really focused on college and career readiness and goals related to that. Our assessment tools have now been adjusted so that we have benchmark assessments that really are aligned to some of the performance-based kinds of measurements that we should really be doing anyway. And so we're aligning some of those formative assessments accordingly. But we're not really focusing on necessarily a number, but we're really looking more at the growth model. You know, and again, NCLB focused on a number and a bar that you had to meet. You know, the new measure for us is really looking at growth. Where do kids grow from last year to this year? Missouri's not that different either in that regard. And so those measures for us, when we look at opportunity to learn, you know, those are some of the areas. The other thing that I do want to mention that I think is a positive as well for ESSA, and I'm getting a little feedback on your end, so I don't know if you can still hear me as clearly. But, you know, the states are now required to have, you know, a plan for bullying and restraints and all of those things. I think that, again, I go back to that whole child and that social emotional piece. I think that's an important piece when you start talking about intervention. So the Kansas Learning Network, they're looking at risk factors. And so, you know, a school would qualify to receive support, not based on a number anymore, but based on achievement is part of it, but the other part is looking at the risk factors. Risk factors can be things from the migrant status, the English language learner status, poverty. I mean, that is fantastic. When you're talking about that whole child approach, it's not just did you meet this bar or didn't and being labeled as failure, but it's what are all the risk factors and what are those root causes that are really getting you to where you are, and how do we measure and support that. The Kansas Learning Network is a nice model as well that just wraps around support, and it's not, it doesn't feel punitive in that regard. So we, I think, are ahead of the curve in many ways in that regard.
Thank you. So the next question is about stakeholder engagement. The question is, will USDOE measure the extent to which a state has engaged in meaningful stakeholder engagement? And then part two of that is, are there funds available to commit to this type of engagement?
Well, the answer to the first question is yes, they'll require states to show that they have had public engagement. I can't recall whether there's something about specifically parent engagement, but this will work a lot better in Rhode Island or Delaware than it will in California, which is gigantic and has 6.2 million students. So I really don't think the federal government will hold some meetings and invite people to come and at county offices, but I don't think that's probably what the questioner is asking. So I'm skeptical that the U.S. Department can do much about this. So it's partly up to states and partly up to local school districts and local school boards. In most, large states, Kansas is large and heavily rural, the local school board is the place to go for this. The applications for the federal funds from the local school board to the state education agency will be public. That's the thing to look at, it seems to me, as well as others. But I think the parent engagement will really be at the local level. I do want to mention that California has local indicators in its accountability system, not just the ones I reeled off. And we are requiring local districts to do surveys of parent engagement and of school climate. And that relates to things like bullying, are you safe? But it also relates to, does anybody care about me at this school? We're not going to use those as accountability indicators for federal aid, but we are using those under state policy. So states, a thing to look at for, quote, the whole child and so on is the use of surveys of parents and students. And so the state will vet whether the surveys are scientifically valid and reliable, and the locals will then pick a school climate survey and a parent engagement survey from a state list, but there'll be several, and they will then carry that out locally. So we won't really oversee that other than they give the survey and deliberate at it at the board level.
So the piece of is there funding attached to it, as with as you can imagine what I'll say in terms of mandates and funding. Normally the funding rarely meets the mandate. That's the first piece. In terms of engagement, I think that piece is certainly an expectation, and this is where I encourage parents to be empowered and teachers to be empowered with their voice. I always look at, as particularly in an urban environment or any environment that has a great deal of diversity, what voices are at the table and who's not at the table, and how do we make sure that those voices are heard. And so this is where parents, teachers, and all alike need to be very diligent about understanding what the accountability plan looks like and how it's being rolled out in their individual LEAs. I think that's crucial. And so things like the report card that's mandated and the new additions to what the report card has to have on it for a school district, that should be posted somewhere on the web page. It's also shared in a variety of other areas, and so asking for that and or looking for that on our web page, on Topeka Public Schools web page, under my actual link, under the superintendent's link, there are several different documents that talk about ESSA so that we have transparency. We want our public to be informed. We want to be held accountable for making sure that we are doing the best that we can to ensure that every child does succeed. And so you'll see a link for parents, giving a summary of what ESSA means. And so anyone that's listening to this that wants some of those publications that are out there that are good publications to read, they can certainly go to our website, Topeka Public Schools, look at the superintendent link and find those. The other pieces of engagement, includes for us, we've had town hall meetings, we've had student advisory groups. It's so interesting to me that the main group that we don't pay a lot of attention to in a lot of adult settings are the young people that we're serving. And so making sure that we are diligent about ensuring that students understand what's available to them, what they have the ability to access, what they should advocate for, particularly if they're in a high school and they don't have parents that are advocating as aggressively as they should. And so looking at really who are your stakeholders, and so we go back to that capacity building. If we're going to empower communities to change and be transformed, we have to build capacity in our communities to understand. And as an LEA, we are responsible for giving multiple opportunities for all segments of society to really be able to digest what we have available. So we practice through our town hall meetings, student advisory meetings, website, all of those to be able to see what's available and to understand it. So the requirement, yes, the requirement is there, but I will say that generally, as an LEA, I believe we need to go beyond the requirement to make sure people really understand what's available and that they take advantage of that as a school system, as a parent, a student, and a teacher.
Thank you. We are getting so many questions. I want to remind our folks on the phone to please remain on mute if you're not talking to avoid the feedback. There are several questions that I'm going to try to combine around opportunities to improve school climate. So we have advocates who are looking to reform school discipline when you look at the data in terms of youth of color that are pushed out of school with high suspension rates. So what are opportunities to improve school climate in terms of policing in schools, suspension rates, and also there's a question about corporal punishment and seeing reforms, around discipline through ESSA. Any comments about that?
Yes, I think first of all we need to, I would say first of all, this is an experimental period to understand school climate better and to be able to measure it better locally, perhaps surveys, interviews with students, and things of that sort. But first of all, what is school climate? When I began in this business many years ago, school climate was heavily oriented around the climate for teachers. Did teachers feel that the school was a good place for them to be and for them to teach well? Were they supported? And that was low climate for teachers, led to teacher turnover and leaving the school. Recently, the climate has turned as well to areas around students, and we have a large, significant number of children in a pilot program looking at social emotional learning, including such ideas as positive mindsets and whether the students are developing various work habits through their school, meaning, sticking to tasks and things of that sort. Also mentioned, is this a place that somebody knows me and cares about me? And another aspect of school climate is student engagement. A lot of students report, for example, in high school, they're sitting in their chairs and they're bored. And so there's a lot of elements of school climate, and a lot of people feature different ones. So we're beginning to experiment with empirical surveys and other things to nail this down and define it. And then over time, we'll certainly bring it more into our school reporting systems. But we're showing that school climate predicts achievement in a different way and has influence on our assessment and test results that were much higher than we expected, frankly, higher than I expected. So this is an area of what I would call development, and it's proceeding, however, rapidly with a lot of interest.
I'm going to answer this broadly and then take it down to practicality. For those people that are working in schools, I want them to know when they leave this session, things that they can actually do right now. But I'll talk first about ESSA in general in terms of just kind of the multiple indicators, that really could be measures of success. A lot of this does fall back to surveys. So really it's up to the LEA to make sure to know, once that survey is done, then what do I do with that information? So I'm going to talk about practicality, when you talk about school climate and when you talk about what can happen, what that actually looks like in a school. I tend to think policymakers, the farther you are away from the school, the less you know what you're talking about when it comes to schools. And so I'll talk from the policy standpoint first. First of all, keep in mind when you're talking about ESSA, there are potential indicators, could be multiple measures. So everything from the academic achievement, we talked about that piece, but that school climate is really, evidence from students and staff about instruction, engagement, what teacher engagement looks like. So there are a variety of measures. So it's real important that people know what are the measures that are being used by my state and what does that look like by my LEA for our school system? What does that accountability plan look like as it relates to some of these indicators? And so I'm going to talk about the area specifically when it comes to climate with breaking the school to prison pipeline. And I think that's a huge issue, particularly now with new legislation about breaking the school to prison pipeline, being an additional support, understanding that the way to support students is not to put them in jail and to be trigger happy when it comes to students having issues in school. So with that in mind, for us on a practical level, now this is my first month or two in Topeka Public Schools, so I'm also going to talk about Jennings School District, which was where I was superintendent at the last 4 years. And that district, which was bordering being unaccredited, is now fully accredited, and the majority of students, and this last year may even be 100% now that scores are coming down, but the majority of students now lead straight into a post-secondary opportunity. So you wonder, how do we get there? Well, without significant relationships and changing school climate, you can't move any organization, and it's important to understand that. So beyond the surveys, the big piece about understanding what does learning look like in a classroom, but what opportunities do students have to learn? So I'll tell you what that looks like in Jennings. For us, we opened up a Saturday school. We talked to our parents about being engaged in the school and participating, because that's a school climate piece. And some of our parents shared that they had real issues in terms of things like even washing clothes, because in Jennings, we don't have a laundromat in the city of Jennings. So we put washer and dryers in every school. You wash one load for free in exchange for 1 hour of volunteerism. I mean, these practical ideas about what can you do once you get the survey back to really enhance student engagement. For our students, making sure that we have night school opportunities available. When students fail a test, rather than putting an F and saying I'm done, what are the other opportunities and alternative assessments that you have available for young people to be able to improve? The other piece is discipline, really monitoring and disaggregating it by race, poverty, and all other subgroups, how often you're suspending children to see what those patterns are. I think those things ESSA now provides flexibility with being able to monitor that, but then as an LEA, holding ourselves accountable. In Topeka Public Schools, we are now taking on the issue of trauma and making sure that we become a trauma-informed school district. Jennings was the first trauma-informed school district in St. Louis, and now Topeka is undergoing that work. And that work means that we have to understand the story behind the behavior. And so our entire staff has really wrapped their arms around this issue of making sure social-emotionally we're supporting our young people. Rather than suspending them, we really have creative ways in which to support young people in school and keeping them in school. So we're really tracking that. I will tell you that I very much believe in the Every Child Succeeds Act. I really do. Without even the legislation, there are things we were doing in my past district. I just think this formally gives us greater flexibility and greater accountability measures. But as with all systems, a system is only but a system. You have to make sure that it's being followed, measured, and monitored. And teachers, for sure, certainly should make sure that they understand the accountability system and are also equally holding their school system accountable for meeting the needs that are, listed in that accountability system.
Dr. Kirsch, did you want to add anything?
No.
Sorry. We are drawing close to time, so I wanted to, we apologize for not being able to get to all the questions, but we are more than happy to continue the conversation on Twitter. John, do you have anything you want to add to the conversation before I close us out?
No, I want to thank Dr. Anderson and Dr. Kurse. California is all the better, Dr. Kurse, for having you on the case there, and definitely Kansas and Topeka is all the better for having you on the case there, Dr. Anderson. And we're all the better to have the opportunity to tap into your thought leadership, your practical advice, and all that you are doing to provide all students an opportunity to learn. So on behalf of the Schott Foundation and advocates across the country, I want to thank you for participating in the webinar. We look forward to continue engaging, working to accelerate the type of advocacy that's necessary to address those whole child needs and to provide all students an opportunity to learn. So in the meantime, let's all keep learning, keep fighting, and keep loving one another. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Anderson. Thank you, Dr. Kurse. Thank you for everyone watching. Please continue to chat with us on Twitter, as well as to check out the Schott website for our next webinar in our series, which will be on December the 9th, where we will, at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will have a conversation about testing. That webinar is entitled Busting the Bubbles. Is there a link between standardized tests and improved learning? So we hope you all will join us again in December for that event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.